Welcome. This is a panel discussion of a new book by me, Ellen Feldman, and 29 other photographers, and it's called We Who March. The full title is quite long. It's We Who March, Photographs and Reflections on the Women's March, January 21st, 2017. This includes photos from all across the country, primarily from, as is listed on the back cover, Washington, D.C., New York, Boston, Chicago, but there are also other photos from New Orleans, Atlanta, Georgia, Concord, New Hampshire, Los Angeles, Trenton, New Jersey, and Austin, Texas. Why did I work on this book? Why did I create it? Basically because after the election, I needed some way to address my anxiety and my rage at how the election turned out. And when I heard about the organizing of the Women's March, I knew instantly that I wanted to participate in it. And I also knew instantly that I wanted to do a photo book. At first, I thought the photo book would be my own photos. Then I realized it would be so much more powerful if I could invite other photographers from around the country. At first from around the world, but I quickly realized that that was kind of beyond my ken. So I stuck with photographers from around the country. I then decided that I also wanted to have some text, and I wanted to have comments from the marchers who were there. So in some cases, when I felt like I had a couple moments after I took a photo of somebody, I asked them for their email address, and I wrote to them after the march and asked them if they wanted to provide a comment about their experience at the march. So in the end, I have photos by 30 photographers, by 20 people who commented on the march, and then I asked Susan M. Reverby, who taught women and gender studies at Wellesley College and who lives in Cambridge, to write the introduction about the significance of women's demonstrations around the country. All proceeds from the sale of the book will go to Planned Parenthood. So now I'd like to introduce each of our panelists. I'll start with Debi Milligan. Debi Milligan is a photographer, feminist, and educator. Her photography concentrates on fine art landscape and portraiture, and she is especially interested in alternative processes that highlight the painterly hand of the photographer and the artist. For 14 years, she has been teaching both analog and digital photography at Cambridge Ringe and Latin High School, and she has also taught at the New England School of Photography. Debi is a contributor to the book Our Bodies, Ourselves, writing the section on pelvic inflammatory disease in 1983. Debi studied art with feminist artists Joan Snyder and Miriam Shapiro in the 1970s at Princeton University and at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Linda Haas. Linda Haas is a Cambridge-based freelance photographer and teacher of photography. She has been politically aware and active since childhood and is the daughter of Holocaust survivors and refugees. She began her career as a photojournalist and still brings that sensibility to her work, whether in travel, editorial, or portrait photography. She's happiest when her photos contribute to the movement for social change. She's the stepmother of 3, grandmother of 5, and this March and April, she will have a photo exhibit at CCTV in Cambridge. As Linda said to me, she's trying her best to retain hope for the future. Susan M. Reverby is a historian and professor emerita of women's and gender studies at Wellesley College, where she taught for more than 3 decades. She is, as she puts it, repurposed, not retired, on a fellowship this year in the history department at Harvard. She's working on a biography of an American AIDS activist doctor who had also been a U.S. political prisoner in the 1980s. I would like to start our discussion with the first question is, why were you interested in going to the march, and why were you interested in contributing to the book, We Who March? Why don't we start with Debi?
Okay.
I went to the march because I thought it was really important to go, but I also went to the march in part for my sister, one of my sisters who is housebound with MS. And I felt like she really wanted to be there and she couldn't be there. And so I went there to be sure that in some way she would be there with me.
And you decided to contribute to the book for what reason?
I contributed to the book because I took my camera to the march, and it was an amazing experience visually. And your call for photographs really had me go back through my photographs and edit and think about them, and I really wanted to be a part of it.
All right, thank you. Linda, what made you decide to go to the march and then contribute to the book?
Well, first, I suppose that when I heard about the march, it wasn't a decision process. It felt natural. Of course, I will be going to this march. After the election, I and so many others just faced this desperate despair. And I think the very fact of the march was a way for us to take action, to come together with the community and to begin to mobilize to confront the dramatic turn that we saw happening in our country. Also, I think I'll say that in Susan's introduction to the book, she talked about the march being an important place to express our values and beliefs. And that really rang true with me, that you wrote that, because it was such an important thing for me to be able to do that.
Thank you. I'm glad it resonated.
Yeah, I would say yes. I responded to that as well.
Yeah.
So
There was so much outrage among all of us, but among women, at what was going on. And I think we needed it to come together, to express it together.
Mm. I remember too, for me, when Clarence Thomas was voted in to the Supreme Court, and we were at a demonstration briefly in downtown Boston, and then we didn't do anything. We all we came back to Cambridge and went drinking, but it seemed like a pretty weak response, and so I felt the same anger that I felt then, that this was an election that brought out not the worst of America, not the best of America. And I had this feeling that all of us who would be there would try to voice a sense of the country in a much different way. And I didn't want to just go drinking. I really wanted to be there with other people and as many people as possible. And I had a sense. Then I started to talk to people, and everybody I knew was going somewhere, in some city, somewhere, wherever they were. And I have family in Washington, so for me it was, I really want to be in the belly of the beast, and I want to be there, and I want to be able to sort of just express my outrage that he was elected, and to be part of a group of people who were going to say, not just today, but every day since you've been elected, we will do something about this. So I thought it was really important that it was the day after the inauguration. I thought it was really it made a beautiful political point the minute he started.
Yeah. Actually, as well, I think for me, one of the hardest things to take about the election was not even just the fact that he was elected, which of course was horrific, and that the Republicans had taken control of both the House and the Senate, but on a more profound level, that so many people in this country would actually vote for him. Yes, it wasn't a majority, but it was pretty close to it, and that there are that many people who would do that was so horrific to me. I think that the coming together of such a large community of people at these marches was a really important thing to be part of and to see and to witness.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I wanted the book to convey was that there was a multitude of people of different identities who participated in the march, and I tried to be as comprehensive as I could with gender identity, sexuality, race, cultural origin, both men and women, young and old, and
all the ambiguous in-betweens.
all the in-betweens, exactly,
Right.
of which
Right.
there's such a plethora right now. And I think that a book like this was necessary to really show you the gamut of the kind of people that participated.
And the unity behind all of these different people who all felt powerless. And then once we came together, there was this incredible feeling of power.
Yes.
And fueling of the movement
Right.
for us together. I think the book speaks to that,
Right.
and you see it in the photographers' photographs.
I think that was one of the things that's so powerful about as a non-photographer. For me, what was so powerful about the pictures that you all took was it really captures it. I mean, I felt like I was there again, and it captures the color and the vibrancy of the day. It really, you can feel it in the photographs that you took. And I think for people who were there, it will be meaningful. And for people who couldn't or didn't make it, I think it will be meaningful for them too in a different way, because you really get a sense of it, and especially because it's in color, and it's just, it's just exciting. I mean, the excitement, it's almost like without the live thing that, that your phone now can do in the pictures, it felt like that. It's very vibrant, it sort of jumps out without even having that feature, It
was very much the experience. I think the book captures what it was like to be there.
I know, I think so too.
It's like you can feel it.
Yeah. Well, it's visceral. It's just because of the photography, in a way that even the most beautiful writing can't capture the way in which a photograph done by those of you with such great craft can really make real.
Yeah, that feeling that was there of both the shock, the outrage, the anger, but combined with the strength and the positive sentiments that were expressed. I think that was a unique thing about
Right.
the event, and it is captured in the book.
The
as well.
exuberance.
The
Yeah.
exuberance is
Joy,
that we
joy,
felt.
and rage.
Yes,
Joy
right.
and rage.
It was joyous
together.
rage. It really was
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah.
That's right.
So there are other books on the march out there, and I'm just wondering, I think we've talked a little bit about this so far, but I wonder what you think is different about this book. Let me just show it again. I am a little proud of it. What is different about this book, We Who March?
Well, I think that one of the things that makes it different is that these are all working photographers. And so I think everyone who went out shooting on that day had an eye and was looking for a photograph. And the signs were just amazing. And so it wasn't just something that someone might put together on Instagram with a bunch of strangers. It was really photographers out there, men and women, mostly women, but a few men, and sort of out there with their cameras, really looking for that moment.
Yes, that is what we do. that is it.
Your
As
pictures
a street photographer, I can just say that you're around in a huge crowd and you're just looking for that one moment, that one figure that will be iconic and that will say what you want it to say.
Yeah, let me rephrase that. I've been to many marches and demonstrations over the last decades, and I always bring my camera. It wouldn't have occurred to me to go to this march without my camera. I've done it for so many years. It's a second nature to me now when I'm there to be looking for those moments, to be looking for those images. This particular demonstration was just full of them with such inventive signs. I couldn't believe the wonderful signs that were everywhere, with the great diversity that was there. It was very photogenic. In this book in particular, I think captures that. You ask why this book, and as opposed to other books. I have to admit I haven't seen the other books. But what I can say about this book is that it really is a book that comes from the people who were there. You can tell that it's made by us. It's not put together by some conglomerate that wants to portray the event in one way or another, but instead it feels more like the groundswell that it was, and I think that's an important thing about this book. Another very important thing about this book is that if there are any proceeds, they will go to Planned Parenthood, which to me is an important thing to note.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. It was important to me to not just create a book where we could commemorate the march, but also that in its sales, in its production, would benefit a nonprofit agency that is in jeopardy always by having its funding cut by the government. And so I wanted the book to be able to support that.
But the book also that way reflects what the march was about, because it was both about the outrage about what had happened, but it was also about, well, where do we go from here? And it seems to me by giving the money to Planned Parenthood, it's a political statement. This is not just something you put on your coffee table or show your grandchildren, I was there, but it's, it really feels like something that is in the spirit of the march itself.
It's also, I think, the personal is political, and you really feel that in the photographs that you chose to put in the book, because on the one hand you get the big march, and you get the feeling of how large the marches were and how many different kinds of people were there, and then you also get close-ups of individual emotional responses to things that are going on. And so you have this wide range, and so it feels like you're at the march, and like these people.
Right.
I would also like to just add that it was important to me to have comments, text from people who were at the march, not just the photographs, because I think that text plus photographs can make a really strong comment. And in the book there are comments by 20 marchers, and they were all reflective because I asked them after the march, during the march I asked them for their email addresses, and after the march I wrote to them and saw if they would want to contribute a comment to the march. I would like to read one comment. I think it kind of summarizes the feelings that a lot of us had at the march and the reasons why we went there. This is a comment by Mariah Grubb. She's a social justice advocate who marched in Washington, D.C. And her comment is as follows: I march for those who cannot. I march in solidarity with all disenfranchised populations. I march as a reminder of my privilege. I march for hope. I march because I can. For me, to march is not a single day of action. To march is to commit to standing up in the face of injustice, sacrificing your comfort so that others may have the chance to experience some comfort of their own. To march is to commit to facing your own privilege and leveraging it for those with less. To demanding environmental, social, and economic justice. To march is to commit to creating fair policies from housing and healthcare to immigration and gender equity, to supporting indigenous sovereignty, to rejecting bigotry and persecution of any and all marginalized populations. To march is to commit to giving more and taking less, to being compassionate and thoughtful, to seeking equanimity. To march is to commit to accepting love and rejecting hate. And it seems to me that this is what we were there for. And there are 19 other comments that are also very eloquent. And I thought it was important not just to have photographs, but to have people's thoughts about the march too, and what they were there for.
Right. And because it's collective, that's what's also lovely about it. So you get a range of people's feelings. I mean, that one's just spectacularly sums it up, but each one is different, and therefore you have a sense of the personal reasons people are there and the larger political moment at the same time. So it's almost like, you should excuse the expression, being back in a consciousness-raising group, in that sense of everybody speaks their truth, and this time, and they're speaking their truth to power very clearly. So I thought that was great.
And speaking of that, the ages
Yeah.
was so remarkable. The
It was
ages
great.
from really
Yeah.
small children, babies, and little girls, little boys, and then elderly women who were there who had marched through the 60s
Or earlier.
or earlier. Yep.
Older than us. Even people older than us.
It was amazing.
Yeah, it was amazing. It felt like such a cross-section. I think that was what was so fabulous. You couldn't say, oh, this is just, those ladies from Cambridge. It didn't feel like that at all. It really felt like this is America, and this is what we stand for. So I thought that was remarkable.
And the signs of the women that were in their 20s were so outrageous and
they
so
were.
brave, so courageous.
Yeah, I agree.
I was very impressed by that as well.
Yeah. And the dress up, like the women in Wonder Woman costumes, and just the hat, and then the hats. I mean, when they first came out with the pussy hats, I thought, oh my God, I can't wear one of these. I'm not gonna wear a pink, oh my God, right? And then it felt like, wow, what a visual. And you can see it in the photographs. There's something, it's like this, what it provided was a unity thread in the photographs and at the march. So even though we all look different, there was something about all that pink out there that was like everybody was wearing the same.
And also, if you think about it, it was January 21st.
Right.
It was a day where, in the winter, where people usually wear browns and blacks and grays.
Right.
And in the long shots, in the wide shots, even on the cover, the pink hats, what they do is they bring out a feeling of celebration.
Yes.
That you would not have if this was the normal shot
Right.
of parades or of people congregating on January 21st.
Right.
In the middle of the winter.
Right.
So, my hat's off.
It was great.
So I'd like to ask Susan, who wrote the introduction to the book, to talk a little bit about the history of Women's March, this march, how it relates to earlier marches, how we can think about women who have marched. And so Susan, can you tell us something about how the march fit in the context of earlier women's protests?
Right. So even before women had the vote, we have used the streets, because you think about it, women were not supposed to use the streets, that even becoming a, quote, public woman was associated actually with sex workers. So there's an enormous political statement when groups of us take over the streets. And so from the beginnings of the Republic, really, women have, on occasion when they needed to, spoken through kosher meat boycotts, where women were in the streets in the Lower East Side at the turn of the century, all of the beginning suffrage marches and parades before women had the vote, and then all of the participation that women had either as workers or as people of color in various marches to those effects, or through the reproductive rights marches of the 60s and 70s. So the use of the street is really a statement that says we're here. And we are not going to be pushed back into any place. And so I think it's particularly powerful always when people use the streets, but I think it's particularly meaningful when women do it. So there's a history of doing this. I've been on, I'm old enough to have been on, I don't know, scores of these already. But this felt really different, in part because it felt sort of leaderless. That is, I know there was a group of women who organized it, but I didn't know who they were really. I didn't come with ready-made signs where someone said, here are the 5 pre-approved statements that everybody's supposed to carry. None of us did that. There were a couple of printed signs from the ACLU or from Planned Parenthood, but most of us came with homemade signs, which I thought was just completely different from what I've seen before. And as we've been talking about, it also felt really visceral, and that people desperately needed to be there with each other, both individually and collectively. So I thought that's what really made it different. And I also thought it recognized the wide variety of people who are concerned about these issues. So no one could say, as I said earlier, that it was just one group of people or one kind of person. And because it took place on every continent in the world, probably for the first time ever, it was a kind of interesting, both intersectional in terms of people's different kinds of multiple concerns, but also international in the best sense of that word. And that felt really different. I mean, some of the anti-nuke marches in the 80s was a little bit like this. I was with 1 million people in New York, for example, in 1982. But this felt so different, and because you could barely move. I mean, it was just amazing. I mean, I was in Washington and you could hardly move. I mean, it was really, you were just packed in. And then when it sort of piddled out and ended, you couldn't even get on the metro because it was so full. And so people were walking from one metro station to another to try to get on. We took over the streets in downtown Washington, even though that wasn't part of the parade route, and no one stopped us. I mean, that was what was so remarkable, that you left with that sense of having the whole place. And just being really clear that even if he had been elected, he was going to be stopped by as much as possible. And I think the last thing I'd say, I didn't write this in the intro, but I've been thinking a lot about the rise of all the women talking about the sexual, and some men too, obviously, about the sexual harassment and the Me Too movement. And I think it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the march. I think that sense that this is one manifestation right now politically of the response that says this person, who were he in any other job, would be fired, but he's the president and he's being protected, but we are not letting this happen anywhere else, and if we can get him, we'll get him too, but this is unacceptable. And I think that grew out of the feeling of collectivity in the march. Can't prove it, but that's my sense politically of what happened.
I have to say, I totally agree.
Oh, good.
Totally and
It rings true for
completely.
me.
Does it too? Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I thought about, and watching this over the last
Yeah.
bit. It's like
I
the
think-
sleeping giant got woken up. And I think the use of the
Yes.
term woke is really interesting. I mean, it comes mostly out of people of color speaking to white people in general, and out of the anti-carceral movements, but that language of staying woke, of understanding how the country really works and being responsible for doing something about that, I think has stayed with us now more than a year, almost a year later now.
I do have a photo that I'll show, the first page of chapter 6, which is "We will stay woke."
Yeah.
We'll stay woke. And the sign is being held. If you look at inside the chapter, you'll see that the sign is being held by a black woman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's the demand on us to not, and that speaks to what your, the person you quoted from, who spoke, because she said, look, some of us are more privileged than others, but what are you going to do? You can't help where you were born. It's a question of what you're going to do with it that matters. Whose lives are you going to support? What politically are you going to do? Not just to make yourself comfortable, but to be part of a wide humanity. And I think that the term woke speaks to that. And the photographs, I think, in the book speak to that as well.
I think you captured that in the book, in that it's not just a record of what happened, of one event. It pulls toward action, I think. The way you organize the book and the chapters, and the idea that I think it ends with young people, like very young people, who are at the march, and that there is a future, there's a movement toward action that you feel throughout the book.
Yes, I begin the book with second wave feminists, people of our generation, and I end it with the children. And this girl, you see a girl, I see the future, and that's intentional. They do have to carry on. So, and I think that they will. There were a lot of young children at the march. I think they will carry on.
I think also one of the things that happens with, my experience of teaching at a place like Wellesley is that a lot of students think at that some point that everything's been taken care of, that somehow all of these problems were solved by us, and if they weren't, well, then there's just a few things hanging on, but they don't really think about it. And I think the sexual harassment thing coming to light like this, I think, has really woken people up, again, to use that word, about how much we tried to say and do, but how much more is out there, and that it's a continual battle, that we can't overdo, we're fighting against millions of years of a particular way of organizing human beings together. And I think we can't expect that in 50 or 60 years we can do everything to make it better. We just can't. So I think that sense is captured in the book of, as the la luta continue, the idea that the battle has to continue, really comes across in the book as well.
I'd like to turn now to some photographs in the book itself and ask you if there's a particular photo or perhaps two photos to which you particularly respond. And actually, I do have the answers here, so I'll just credit the photographers, because I noticed that except for me, you all chose photographs that you did not take yourselves. So the photo that Linda is going to speak about is a photo by Jane Fulton Alt, who was a photographer from Chicago, and but she marched in New Orleans. So Linda, would you like to talk about that photograph?
Sure. Well, I actually wanted to say a few words about this photo that was mentioned earlier, where it's a photo of a young girl holding a sign that says, "You see a girl, I see the future." And this is the photo that Ellen chose to be not only the final image in the book, but also the image on the back cover of the book. And I think it was a really well-chosen image for that position, in that this really, in the end, is so much of why we were all there, I think, because in this time of despair for so many of us, and we've been trying to fight this despair with some success or non-success, but when I remind myself of this message, it gives me some strength to keep that fight going. It, of course, now makes me think of my grandchildren, and that we must continue to fight to leave a better world for them than that which exists right now. At the same time, it makes me think of my personal history, which is that both of my parents were survivors of the Holocaust, were refugees from Germany. And my father, of course, both my parents told me many stories, but two stories that my father would tell come to my mind in thinking about this photograph, which is a bit of a stretch. But the first one was that he would talk about a friend of his who he ran into on the street shortly after Hitler was elected into office. And this man informed my father that he had in fact voted for Hitler. And my father said, "How could you have done such a thing?" And he said, "Look, we're in such a dire circumstance in this country now. We'll vote him into office. We'll see how he does. And if we don't like it, we'll vote him out." We know how that turned out. On the other hand, in the early 70s, my parents made their first return trip to Germany since they fled. And there's a photo that exists of my father in front of his family home with an old woman running towards him with outstretched arms. And I remember saying, "What's the story here?" And he said that after his mother, my grandmother, was refused permission to buy milk anymore, this neighbor would sneak milk to my mother. And really what that tells me is that there are so many ways to resist. That there are the big ways of resisting, and then there are the little things you can do that can profoundly affect the lives of people who are suffering. And for this girl, we have to do both of those.
Thank you. So Debbie?
I was,
Oh, why don't I introduce? Okay, this is a photo by Andrea Rosenthal from Boston.
so this is a photo of a woman carrying a sign that says, cancer took my uterus, but Obamacare saved my life. Protect the ACA. And I just think that right now, today, that this photo is so meaningful. And I was really struck by how brave and courageous and out there this woman was with her sign, and also her expression, the emotion that she's showing, where she's smiling and she's triumphant over her cancer, and at the same time she's active and she's pushing against things.
And the next photo is by Laura Brody,
Oh, there you go.
and she lives in Provincetown.
And that one is Mormon Feminists for Equality. I chose that one because the Mormon Church is just one organization that is not known for its equal treatment of women. And I remember seeing this woman at the march and just being so glad to see, oh yes, there's feminists in the Mormon Church and they're fighting the good fight, and here is one representing them. So there were so many moments like that, you know. And she looks, again, so proud and so involved, and I think capturing those things, those emotions are clearly what makes it such a personal experience looking through the book.
And Susan, you chose a photo by Edie Bressler, who lives in Somerville.
So I picked this one because it's a multiracial group of women, and they look both serious and joyful at the same time. And I also thought the sign that they had was fantastic, that says, "The humanity of all Americans is diminished when any group is denied the rights granted." And I just thought it captured the spirit of the march, like the phrase that you read before. And because it has women of all ages, there's a man in the corner, it just felt like it captured everything for me, that it felt like being there.
Well, I chose a couple of different photos. The first is a photo spread. I wanted to actually talk a little bit about how I put the book together, which is that, you know, of course, in a book of photos like this, there is a conversation between the two pairs, the two photographs on both sides of the page. And in this one, the people actually seem like that they're communicating, even though they're far from each other, that I put them together in this book so that they could talk to each other across the divide of the page. And I would say that in building the book, one of my primary focuses was, how am I pairing these photos from one side of the page to the other? And I put a great deal of attention in that. The other, oh, by the way, both of these photos I took, but I took them at different times of the day. This is a photo by Yvonne Bastul. And the sign says, "Nobody likes you," which I thought was very funny, very serious, and also I think you can read a lot into the juxtaposition of this photograph and the one on the facing page. I also wanted to call your attention to the black border around these two photos. I use it every once in a while in the book to give us a sense of the shock of what it means to have Trump as president. And so the pages that were really anti-Trump, I put a border around so it would kind of shock us into a sense of recognition.
And not as if you were in mourning and covering the mirrors.
Oh, I didn't even think of that.
I was thinking about Jewish rituals for mourning include covering the mirror, so it felt like, so we don't want to see ourselves reflected in him almost, you know?
Yeah.
It has that feel.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the photograph that where all the people are each have a piece of the word narcissist.
Yeah, that was great.
I think one of the things that was remarkable about the marches was they planned that.
Yeah.
They made those.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
they got there with that, and you saw that over and over again. That people had a kind of a message, and they had worked hard together as a group to get that message across.
Yes, I agree. I think that if we think about the marches, we've talked so many times in so many ways about that it was building community, and that will see us through.
Right. Right. And it was community that was, as you were saying, that was community that was already organized before they got there in that case, but it was also community that wasn't, that you made it by who you sat next to on the bus going down or the train, or who you ended up walking near or sharing water with. Like it turned out there's a woman who Ellen took a photograph of, and I looked at it and I went, oh, I know who she is, because we were exhausted and they had managed to bring a tarp, which we had not, and the ground was really cold and wet, and they put it down and we sat with them while we were just trying to catch our breath. And I thought, oh, I know that, you know. So there was that sense of getting to know somebody, of people were sharing food and space and water, and you know, because it was a long I mean, I remember looking at my Fitbit or something, I think we marched 5 or 6 miles that day, which is just, for me anyway, a long march. And I was so struck by the ability to keep going because of that collectivity. And that says something too, I think.
Just to continue that theme, I also was struck by the positive energy, to not coin a phrase, of all the people around me, that everybody felt like an instant community.
That's right.
That there was a joint effort, that we were in this together, and that we were supporting each other. And I was here in Boston, and I have never seen, I'm sure there hasn't been a march or a demonstration in Boston that was that large.
Right.
And that the whole thing felt so mellow in a way, in the sense that there was no hostility between anybody there. It was us together facing what was out there,
Right.
as opposed to anything happening other than positive feelings between us. It
think
was
that's right.
remarkable,
Yeah.
frankly.
Yeah.
There was a woman when I got downtown off the T in Boston who was in a wheelchair by herself, just maneuvering in this crowd of people, and people were helping and moving out of the way and doing whatever. But the courage that it took for her to get into this huge crowd and go with it, you know. You saw that over and over again. You saw people who could barely walk.
Yes, absolutely.
And staying with it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the determination
Right.
to be part of the masses.
Baby
Yeah,
carriages and
absolutely.
people carrying, you know,
Canes.
kids.
People with canes and crutches, yes.
It was like this really big collective no.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
it really just
Yeah.
felt like no exclamation point, you know, and that we were going to take the country back, I think, in some sense, for at least for a few minutes anyway.
Yeah.
We will still do that. We will do that.
The world of our better natures, right?
Yes.
Right. On the other hand, I also think, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this because I have a brother who's a Trump supporter, so the fights go on in my family. And it's just interesting to try to figure out and think a little bit about why other people were celebrating that day in a different way than we were. And I think we have to think about that too. But at least for that moment, that work I didn't have to do that day. I mean, that was for the day after the continued fights with him, but I needed to think about being made strong by everybody around me. Okay, so I'm the I'm the amateur, let's put it that way, photographer in the group, but I know how to write a book, but I don't know how to put a group of photographs together in this. So I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about what the process is when you put a book together like this. How do you
Sure.
make the choices? How do you figure out what the themes are? How do you do it?
It's actually, none of it is easy. The easy part was inviting a whole bunch of photographers to submit photos to me, and they did, and I had hundreds, literally hundreds of photographs from different photographers. I would do an initial search, and the ones that I liked, I had 4x6s made, 4x6-inch little photos. I went to a big classroom where there were large tables, and I put all the photos out. And that way, rather than using a digital process, I could see which photos went together, which photos spoke to me, which photos I could group together in a chapter. And that way I could start the selection process. There were, of course, redundancies, so I could easily take those out. The first draft that I did of the book was 165 photos. I ended up with 123. And in the interim, other people kept sending me photographs. So starting with 165 and ending with 123 didn't mean I was just removing. I was adding, resequencing, and removing photographs. As I said before, one of the things that really interests me is how to create that pair of two photos on a spread. I literally think of them as diptychs. And of course, every once in a while, I would say, this photo, I want to cover the 2-page spread. And so you'll see some of those too. I think of, the book started off with crowd shots because everybody was so impressed by the number of people. I think that they say that there are 5 million marchers worldwide, and that this was the largest international march ever recorded. And I believe that, so I wanted to start wide. But pretty soon, right after the first chapter, I went to individual, much more personal photos or small groupings of people. And as we said before, I started at with my generation, the second wave feminists, and ended with the children. And in between, I had, by turns, our struggle against what we saw as the terrible results of that election, and also a commitment to working to change things, and also some joy and in the camaraderie that we felt that day. So those were the kind of the pieces that I was trying to put together. I'm a musician, and when I think of the way that you put together a whole book, the arc of the book, and also the arc of each chapter, I do think in terms of music. And if you think of a piece of music, there are always gradual changes. For instance, gradual going from soft to loud, from loud to soft. And then you also have those moments where there will be a crash of the cymbal from going from a pianissimo, a very quiet moment, to a suddenly loud, shocking sound. And those photos were those photos that I surrounded with a black border, and were the anti-Trump moments. Other than that, I did try to have kind of different crescendos and diminuendos that I was intentional about it. I don't expect that the viewer, the reader of the book, will grasp all of my nuanced feelings and thoughts about the way that I organized the photos in the book. But just to say that that's kind of what we do, what photographers do when they put a book together.
You sense the rhythm of this, whether people get your particular, fine tuning. There is a rhythm to the series and the sequencing in the book that I think you hit it with the chapters. I think you got it.
Did you know what the chapters were going to be ahead of time, or did they come out of the photographs
They
themselves?
came out of the photographs. The first thing that I thought of was I wanted to start with us, the second wave feminists. I wanted to end with the children. Adding the crowd shots in the beginning came later. At one point I had a chapter of issues, and a friend of mine said, well, the whole book is about issues. So that chapter kind of went another way, and I ended up calling it like Our Bodies, Our Minds. And it did manage to get in some of the issues, Planned Parenthood, ACA, Obamacare. So just to wrap up, I would just like to thank my 3 contributors, 3 partners in crime, Debi Milligan, Linda Haas, Susan M. Reverby, for coming in and talking with us about the march, about what we learned from it, and about our contributions to the book, We Who March. Thank you all for coming in.
Thank you for the
you.
opportunity to do this.
I'm thrilled to be a part of this
Me
project.
too. Me too.
It's very exciting.
Thanks. And stay tuned. The next image will be ways to find out more about the book, and also ways that you can purchase the book.